In addition to making my own music for the past couple of decades at this point, I've also been helping other people with their music for the last several years. I get emails, I get messages all the time, every single day, from composers who find themselves in this place where they have a bunch of fragmented ideas that they can't figure out how to develop and arrange. Because they want to make something that feels coherent and feels focused, but they aren't sure how to get from fragmented idea to finished piece of music. And there are three recurring things that keep coming up over and over. Today, we're just going to take them one by one and address them, and I'll show you some ways that you can more clearly express yourself through your music, because I think that's kind of the goal for most of us. When I was 17, a freshman in college, I wrote an essay about how music that was technically demanding was inherently better, so stupid, than music that was easier to play. In my defense, I was a very pretentious 17-year-old who was listening to a lot of prog rock, and I could play piano really fast. And so I thought that that was what music was all about, was a vehicle to show off. At that time, I absolutely believed that virtuosity equaled complexity, or equaled sophistication. And today, I get a lot of comments from people who specifically use the word complex as a describing word for what they want their music to be. And I think they might misunderstand that word much in the same way that I did as a younger composer. Because when I listen to their attempts to make more complex music, as they put it, it definitely reminds me of the way that I used to think of it as a 17-year-old. More notes, faster equals better. So you can imagine my confusion when I had matured a few years and still couldn't write music that I was happy with, when my composition teacher sat me down and in my first composition lesson said, "Less is more." And just like that, he completely demolished my entire worldview up until that point of just wanting to write fast and impressive things. But it revealed to me that my favorite composers, even the ones who were writing very virtuosic music like Rachmaninoff and Ravel, Debussy, Prokofiev, they were using that same principle, less is more, because they were taking a few ideas, sometimes very simple ideas, and developing them. They were embracing certain limitations and going deeper into those ideas rather than just flitting around from ill-conceived concept to ill-conceived theme to ill-conceived sequence, just randomly throwing all of these sentence fragments, as I call them, out. So embracing intentional limitations and focusing on a few powerful ideas is a sign of maturity. And I've come to refer to this as doing more with less, because I think that's maybe a better descriptor of what's actually happening. Taking one or two really strong ideas that we've crafted and worked out, and then developing them. So complexity isn't cramming more notes into a piece of music and just hoping that some of them stick. Complexity, to me, is understanding how to express and develop your ideas so clearly that it almost feels effortless, that someone listening to it thinks, oh, well, that just seems like it came out all in one piece, and almost like I could do that, when the fact is there's a tremendous amount of craft involved. I've used the analogy before with some of my students that it's like a craftsman or a woodworker. The best ones, when they make a table or make a chair, you really can't feel, when you run your hand across it, where the two pieces of wood join. Everything looks like it was all one piece. It feels like it was just always supposed to be a chair, right? That's exactly what great composers are able to do as well. You don't feel the cracks where things were put together, even though, as we'll talk about in just a little bit, they often aren't put together in one piece like we might think or hope. As composers, they just fall out of us in one complete form. That very seldom happens. Confession time, I am a textbook overthinker, okay? I overanalyze, I think about how I'm going to respond to a person before they've finished talking to me sometimes. I've really had to work on that. And the way that that translates to my music is I am constantly overcooking ideas and trying to do too much. So this principle reminds me to stay focused on just one or two ideas and then figure out ways that I can mine more ideas out of that idea. Focused on a minimal amount of material and trying to figure out how to get the maximum amount of things out of that. So then I have building blocks that keep me focused and that I can use to develop more material out of. And it also helps the listener stay focused because everything feels coherent because I've mined my material out of just one or two strong ideas. So how do you apply this? Well, try just simply stating a very clear idea and then write it down or record it in your DAW, record the MIDI. Once you have something in the physical world, you can start to tinker with it without getting lost and destroying what the idea originally was. If you never physically commit to it and get it out of your head and into the real world, it's very easy to flit about from one idea to the next and lose maybe what was your favorite idea. That's when we start drifting around from sentence fragment to sentence fragment and end up with just a bunch of random rambling, which, funny enough, is the name of my next album. Music is a modular process. I use the word linear a lot when I'm talking about how to write chord progressions and how to think of chords as a series of linear parts that all move together to create the vertical chord. And then we have more independent parts that we can take ideas out of and use elsewhere. That's not the point of this video. I have other videos that talk about that. But while I use the word linear a lot when talking about chord progressions, the act of composition itself is not a linear process at all. Music is made up of smaller sections, and most of the time, those smaller sections have even smaller sections within them. And that whole group of sections might make up the larger section, like the A section of our piece. You can think of it like a conversation. There are sentences with different inflections, different shapes, different structures, and those sentences make up paragraphs. And those paragraphs hopefully convey a coherent thought to make one body of work, one argumentative essay, one script, one story, whatever. But very seldom do they all come together on the first try as one completed thing. I believe it was Hemingway that said, "The first draft of anything is shit." Yes, there are times when you just improvise a piece of music and you just want to leave it alone. That happens. That's rare. Instead, what you usually end up with are a lot of snippets, a lot of fragments, a lot of phrases and gestures that might feel like they could go together. And then it's your job as the composer, as the editor, to construct them and arrange them in a way that makes coherent sense. So you might come up with a really cool idea at the end of the process that you think that's actually the most important thing and needs to go at the beginning, or that needs to be repeated so that I emphasize it because my ears want to hear that over and over. I am currently going through this with a piece of music that I'm writing for string orchestra and piano and electronics. And I wrote the theme for this piece like a year and a half ago. I was living in a different house at that point, and then a move happened. Fortunately, I wrote down my ideas, these phrases, these themes that I wanted to develop later. And now I'm in the process of trying to construct them into a coherent piece of music. This is the act of composition. And what I'm finding is I had a rough layout of how I wanted things to go, and now I'm moving things around pretty wildly. Like I might take a B section theme and move it to the beginning and use that as my introduction. That's how this works. It's kind of like editing videos. The video editing software that we use, they're called NLEs, non-linear editors. And it's because in this video, for example, if I say something at the end that I find makes a better hook for the beginning, I can just clip that out and move it to the beginning of the timeline. We can do the same thing in music. DAWs make this very easy to visualize. They are also nonlinear editors. Once we understand that a piece is made up of these smaller building blocks, we can experiment with moving those building blocks around. That's how form is constructed. And you may be thinking, well, how do I know how to arrange things? Like what order things should go in? How often I should repeat certain ideas? Well, my composition teacher, coming in the clutch once again, used to tell me that every piece has a model. And what he meant by that was we can observe what composers have done that works really well in the past, and we can borrow their frameworks. Classical composers used to do this all the time. They would all write sonatas. They would all write symphonies. They would all write rondos. They were all using basically the same forms and decorating them with their own material. And once you have a structure, you can play with that structure a bit. Like Beethoven made a career out of doing that. He did what they would call blurring the lines of form, where he would take other forms and inject them in the middle of his sonatas, like fugues and things like that. And he made it work. And that was his contribution. It wasn't inventing something new, it was using pre-existing forms in new ways. Overall, the biggest takeaway here is just be intentional about mapping things out and experimenting and trying different orderings of the things that you've written. That's composition. That's okay to do. And if you're intentional about mapping things out and just not through composing everything that you write as one big chunk of improvisation, you won't miss opportunities to repeat things that might be your strongest material. Hey, it's me on a different day wearing a different shirt. Just wanted to let you know about a composition challenge, 4-day challenge that I am hosting in just a couple of weeks. If you've ever had the experience of feeling stuck and you have a lot of music on your hard drive that is not finished, you're not alone in that. It is a very common issue. And I'm going to show you some specific exercises, some specific assignments, really a framework that you can go from nothing to a finished piece of music in that 4-day period. And I'll take the guesswork out of it and just give you specific things to focus on. So if that sounds good, sounds like something that you'd be interested in, you can grab your ticket in the link down below. Now back to me from a few days ago. The truth is, composition is not about sitting around waiting for inspiration. This was one of the biggest fallacies with my way of thinking, of putting composers up on a pedestal like they were some mythical creatures and were doing magic that I could never do. It's an empirical process. It's trial and error. It's a lot of error and a lot of trials. And it was one of the benefits that I had of getting to watch a real-life, living, breathing composer work. Because he wouldn't just sit around and wait for ideas. He wouldn't wait for inspiration. He would improvise. And then he would jot ideas down and start to experiment with how he could develop and arrange those ideas. So it looked more like a process to me. He was using improvisation as a mining expedition, getting some ideas down and then developing them from there. And I thought, I can probably do something like that. I think I've already been doing that, I just didn't know it was okay. I was still waiting for my grand opus to float down on its cloud in its completed form, and that just doesn't happen. So yes, he knew a lot of theory, I know a lot of theory, but it's mostly in the subconscious at that point. He's using his taste, he's using his past experience, he's using some theory knowledge working in the background, sure, and he was using his influences to guide his decision-making process, and he was making decisions. That's really what it's all about. So get something down. Cross it out. Get something else down. Cross that out too. Try swapping the order of the first phrase and the second phrase that you came up with. Try different inversions of the chord progressions that you've come up with. Try only using 2 parts instead of 3 or 4 or 5. Try pulling out that interesting little fragment of movement, that little motif that you have in the middle of your melody, and using that as a sequence that you can develop into a B section. This is the act of composition. And once I accepted this and understood this, is when I started writing more music. I started getting more work done. And when I started getting more work done, I was able to do more that I was really happy with, just through the act of practicing over and over. It's a skill. It takes trial lots of error, repetition, and improvement with each iteration.